There are moments in leadership that don't quite make sense. Not the obvious ones, not the ones you've been trained to handle, but the quieter shifts. The ones where something that used to feel clean no longer does. You're still performing, you're still delivering, you're still operating at a level most people around you rely on. And yet there are moments where your access changes. A hesitation where there didn't used to be one. A delay in something that would normally feel immediate. A word that doesn't quite land when you reach for it. And the easiest way to explain it is to place it inside the season you're in. Hormones, perimenopause, menopause, a natural transition. And sometimes that's true. But what if it's not the full picture? What if what you're experiencing isn't a loss of capability, but a signal? And not a signal to step back from leadership, but a signal that the way you're currently leading or the conditions that you're leading within are no longer fully supported by your biology. In this episode, we're going to look at what I call the leadership stand-down signal. What it actually is, why it shows up when it does, and how to understand it in a way that gives you your access back, rather than slowly learning to work around it. Let's get started, shall we? Welcome to Project Joyful, the podcast for health-centered leaders. Project Joyful is a space for conversations at the intersection of leadership, health, and lived experience. Here we explore what it means to lead in ways that honour your body, protect long-term capacity, and support a life that feels as good on the inside as it looks on the outside. This episode is part of the Biology of Leadership series. In this series, we explore leadership through your body, not as a performance to optimize or a mindset to fix, but as a biological experience shaped over time. Leadership doesn't just live in decisions, strategies, or roles. It lives in your nervous system and how responsibility is held and how reliability and care quietly organize your body long before you're consciously aware of it. These conversations are for leaders who are capable, trusted, and effective, and who are curious about how leadership is experienced internally, not just how it performs externally. There's nothing you need to do as you listen, no insight you need to apply. This is simply an invitation to understand what's been shaping your experience of leadership beneath the surface, and what's become possible when biology becomes part of the conversation. Let's begin, shall we? There's a moment that doesn't quite add up. You're in a meeting. You've sat in that meeting countless times before. The conversation moves into territory you know intimately, and you can already feel the shape of what needs to be said forming in your mind. You have the insight, you have the language, you have the experience to back it. And yet, instead of speaking cleanly into that moment, you pause. Not because you don't know, and not because you're unsure, but because something in you holds back in a way that feels unfamiliar. You might notice it in smaller ways too. Rereading an email you would normally respond to in seconds, adjusting the tone, softening the edges, checking it again, not for accuracy, but for something that's harder to name. Or sitting with a decision that you'd usually feel immediate and clean, yet this time it lingers. So you override it, you prepare more, you think through it again. You add another layer of consideration until you can move forward with the same standard that you expect of yourself. And then there are the moments that are harder to ignore. You're in a conversation with a member of your team, and you're reaching for a word that you've used 100 times before, a word that should be right there, and your mind can't quite seem to grab hold of it. You can feel it just out of reach, and for a second there's a blankness that doesn't belong to you. You laugh it off, make a quick comment about it being a menopausal moment, something light, something everyone can relate to, and then you keep going. From the outside, nothing appears off. You're still composed, you're still capable, you're still performing at a level most people around you couldn't even sustain. Your leadership hasn't disappeared. Your intelligence hasn't diminished. Your standards haven't dropped. If anything, you're holding it all together even more tightly. And yet internally something's shifted. Quietly, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. And it doesn't make sense because this isn't who you've known yourself to be. For many women, this is where the explanation comes in, right? You start to place it inside, well, maybe it's a season of life. Could it be perimenopause, menopause, hormonal shifts? And to be clear, there are real physiological changes happening in these transitions, right? Estrogen and progesterone are not just reproductive hormones. They interact with brain function, with neurotransmitters, with regions involved in memory, attention, and processing. So when women describe moments of brain fog, shifts in recall, changes in energy, it's not imagined. These effects have been observed and documented. But at the same time, the science doesn't present this as a one-size-fits-all scenario. These cognitive and energy shifts may not be explained by hormones alone. They sit inside a much more complex picture. Sleep disruption plays a role, particularly where night waking or temperature regulation is affected. Mood changes, even subtle ones, can influence concentration and cognitive sharpness. Fatigue builds up differently. Stress load, which many high-performing women carry at significant levels, has its own impact on memory and executive function. So there are also broader physiological factors that can sit alongside this season. Things like thyroid function, iron levels, metabolic changes, all of which can influence how your brain and body are operating day to day. So what's actually happening isn't this nice, tidy cause and effect relationship, right? It's an overlap. Multiple inputs interacting at once, creating an experience that can feel like it should have a single explanation, but it doesn't. And yet culturally and conversationally, everything tends to get placed into one frame. The pause in the meeting, the extra time on decisions, the word that doesn't quite land. It all gets gathered up and explained as, oh, well, this is just part of menopause. It becomes tidy. It becomes expected. And because it's a valid explanation in some cases, it really gets questioned. And like I said, sometimes that's accurate. Sometimes your biology is moving through a transition that genuinely requires a different pace, a different level of support, a different way of working with your body. And then sometimes it isn't. Sometimes what you're experiencing isn't primarily about the hormonal season you're in, but about the conditions you've been leading under for a very long time. Conditions your body's been compensating for, adapting to, and overriding with precision until it quietly reaches a point where it no longer wants to sustain that pattern in the same way. And when everything's explained through the lens of hormones, you can miss that signal. Not because you lack awareness, but because the explanation is reasonable enough to stop you looking any further. So what if that moment isn't random and it's not just a byproduct of the season you're in, something to be brushed off or worked around, but a signal? Because when you look closely, there's a pattern to where it shows up, right? It tends to appear in the moments where visibility increases, where the stakes are higher, where you're required to be clear, decisive, and expressed. And instead of accessing that cleanly, there's a slight interruption. Not enough to stop you functioning, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to change the internal experience of how you're leading. From a biological perspective, it's not surprising. Your nervous system is constantly scanning for safety, not just physical safety, but psychological and social safety. How you are perceived, whether you are feeling exposed, whether there's a risk in being seen and being wrong and being fully expressed in that moment. And when those conditions begin to register as less than safe, even subtly, your system doesn't remove your capability altogether. It does something far more refined than that. It reduces access. Access to the word that was just there. access to the clarity that normally comes easily, access to the decisiveness you've built your identity on. Not as something that needs to be fixed, but as a form of protection that's designed to keep you within what it perceives as a safer range of expression. And this is what I call the leadership stand down signal. Not because you're stepping away from leadership, but because your system is signaling that the way you're currently leading or the conditions that you're leading within are no longer fully safe for you to operate at your usual level of precision. And when I say safe, in this context, it's not something that your mind is evaluating intellectually, right? It's pattern-based. So it's about familiar, it's about predictable, it's about the same, what your system can anticipate. Because what it's already learned how to manage in terms of energy, exposure, and outcome. Because from a biological perspective, if it can predict it, it can keep you safe. Physically, socially, and psychologically, because prediction comes from what it thinks happened before, and last time you didn't die. So it begins to ask for a recalibration, not loudly, not in a way that disrupts your external performance, but quietly, in a way that you feel internally as a change in access. And if you've built your identity on being the one who holds it all together, who moves cleanly, who gets it right, that signal can feel confusing because it doesn't match who you know yourself to be. But this is not a loss of capability. It's an intelligent shift in how your system's regulating across that capability. What typically happens next is not that you step back. You don't suddenly reduce your standards or lower your level of responsibility. If anything, you do the opposite. You compensate, you prepare more thoroughly, you think things through more carefully, you double check what used to feel immediate. You tighten your control in ways that are almost imperceptible to anyone else, but they feel very real to you. And because you're still delivering, because the outcome is still there, this adjustment doesn't raise any external concern. It can even look like increased diligence, increased care, increased leadership. But internally, it requires more from you. More energy to access the same clarity. More resource to hold the same standard. More awareness to manage something that used to happen naturally. Or you place it inside the hormonal conversation. You contextualize it as part of the season you're in. You make light of it in the moment, maybe, and you just keep moving. And that may well be part of the picture, right? But when that becomes the primary frame, it can quietly close down a deeper level of inquiry. And so that's what today is about. It's an invitation to consider more. So instead of asking what your system's responding to or what's shifted in the conditions that you're leading within, the pattern continues. You override the signal and continue forward in the same way, drawing on more of yourself to sustain what used to feel clean. And this is where leadership starts to feel heavier than it should. Not because anything's gone wrong, but because you're now leading against the feedback that your system is giving you rather than with it. So what starts to change when you see this clearly is where you locate the problem. Because up until this point, it would be easy to assume that something about your capability is shifted, or that you're not quite as sharp, not quite as quick, not quite as resourced as you once were. But that's not actually what's happening. Your capability hasn't disappeared. Your standards haven't dropped. Your intelligence hasn't diminished. What's changed is the internal environment that those capabilities are operating within. Because leadership at this level, it's not just cognitive. It's physiological. It's dependent on how safe your system feels to access clarity, to access language, to access decisive action in real time. And when that internal sense of safety shifts, even subtly, the way those capabilities express will shift with it. So what you're experiencing isn't a reduction in capacity. It's a reduction in access under the current conditions. And that's a very different thing to solve, right? Because capacity problems lead you to push harder, to learn more, to prepare better. Coherence asks something entirely different. It asks for alignment between your internal state and the level at which you're leading. It's the point where your nervous system, your physiology, and your identity are no longer working against each other, but in concert. You know what this feels like. It's the meeting where your thoughts land cleanly without effort. The moment where the right words are there as you need them, not after the fact. Decisions that move quickly, not because you rushed them, but because they're clear. Your body feels steady. Your mind feels available. And there's no excess noise running underneath what you're doing. That's coherence. And when that's present, your clarity returns. Your words come back online. Your decisiveness sharpens. Not as something you force, but as something that's become available again because your system no longer needs to restrict access. So the question becomes different. Not how do I get back to where I was, and not how do I push through so that I can perform at the level I expect of myself, but something far more useful. If this is a signal, what is my system responding to? Because the moment you stop treating it as something to override, you create space to actually see it, to notice when it shows up, what environment it appears in, what the underlying conditions are when your access changes. Not analytically, not by overthinking it, but by observing the pattern with the same level of intelligence that you bring to everything else in your leadership. And from there, a different possibility opens. If your system is already signaling a stand down under certain conditions, what would change if you stopped trying to force yourself forward in those moments, and instead you learned how to bring yourself back online at a higher level of safety? How to work with your biology in a way that restores access rather than restricts it. That's the work. And it's far more precise than most women realize, because once you understand what your system is actually responding to and how to shift those internal conditions, the change in how you lead is not subtle. Not by reducing your ambition, not by stepping away from leadership, but by expanding the range within which your system feels safe to operate. Because when that range expands, your access expands with it. If you're recognizing yourself in this and you're already close to what matters, because this isn't about fixing anything. It's not about managing your way through another phase of leadership. It's about understanding what's actually happening inside your body when your access shifts, and learning how to work with it in a way that sharpens your leadership rather than quietly constraining it. And this is exactly what we open up inside Biology of Leadership. Over 3 days, we go into the physiology behind these moments, what your system is actually responding to, why access changes, and how to recalibrate it so that you're not relying on compensation to maintain your standard. You start to see your patterns differently, and more importantly, you experience what it feels like when your system comes back into a state where clarity, language, and decisiveness are available again without force. It's a different way of leading, and once you feel it, it becomes very clear what you've been compensating for and what's actually possible when your biology is on your side. So if you're recognizing yourself in this, you can register for Biology of Leadership. It's a complimentary 3-day experience. You'll find the details at tracytutty.co.nz/leadership biology. I'm sending you lots of love. Bye for now. Hey, thanks for listening to today's podcast. Can I ask you a favour? If our conversation spoke to you today, could you please take a moment to leave a 5-star review? Your review will help people discover this podcast, and together we can create a world where there's even more love and more laughter. And if you want to hear more from the Project Joyful podcast, just click the subscribe button. Bye for now.